It's the Comics Kid 2099, and I'm pointing at the camera. How are you guys doing? I am here to discuss a graphic novel, X-Men Messiah Complex. I just recently finished this, and as you know by now, I just recently reviewed the prequel to this, follow-up to this called Endangered Species, and now I'm going to be talking about Messiah Complex. First, a little bit of context. This story started in 2007, and at the time it was the first X-Men crossover that we had gotten in a long time. I started reading X-Men comics in 2000-2001, and we really hadn't had an X-Men crossover of any kind in that time that I had been reading comics. Now that I know a little bit more about the history of the X-Men leading up to when I started reading comics, I know that there were a couple of small-scale crossovers right before I started reading comics, like Powerless, Dream's End, Eve of Destruction, but for the most part, we really hadn't had very many X-Men comics crossovers in over a decade. Which makes the saying that IGN put on the back of the book kinda funny. Easily the best X-Men crossover in over a decade. That's not really too hard to do when there haven't really been any X-Men crossovers in over a decade, right? Am I right? Come on. If you haven't read this, you should know that it's huge. See? Look at that. That's really enormous. And the content within, well, it's just as huge as the book itself. I think pretty much the entire X-Men universe shows up here except for Magneto and Apocalypse. I'm not even kidding. The Reavers, the Purifiers, the Marauders, the Acolytes, the Sentinels, Mr. Sinister, and all tying this into Bishop's timeline. That's a lot of X-Men stuff happening in this book. Even though it's a lot of comic book, I still feel like it's way too crowded for this to make any kind of sense as a cohesive story. Now, if you had been reading X-Men comics for 6 or 7 years, as I had been, then this might all make a little bit more sense to you. But right now, if you don't know a great deal about the X-Men, and you saw this on a bookshelf somewhere, and you might say, hey, this is a really big X-Men book, maybe I'll get this and see what it's about. And if you don't know a whole lot about the X-Men, this might be problematic. Furthermore, there really isn't a focus for this story. With something like 30-45 characters showing up here, none of them really take center stage as the main character or the antagonist. There's kind of many bad guys and there's many good guys, and not really any of them have an arc or anything like that that makes you feel like you've gotten to know them over the course of 13 or 14 chapters. Having spent something like 6 years reading X-Men comics without any of these crossovers happening, I can say that I pretty much prefer that kind of storytelling over having a big, huge crossover like this every year. And the reason is, something like Messiah Complex, it's a game changer. It literally changes everything about how the X-Men comics were being done. And yet, a year later, we get another crossover that doesn't even give us any time to breathe after this one is done. If you're going to do something like this, something that completely changes everything about all of the X-Men titles, then you need to give us like 5 or 6 years so that we can really get the sense that, yeah, Messiah Complex changed everything. Look at the consequences and how much all of these titles have changed and grown and, moved on organically. Instead, whenever you do something like this and wait barely a year before you're already doing your next story, well, that's not so much letting things organically happen and grow out of these events. That's just, like I said in my previous video, letting each event be one small chapter in a huge sequence of events. And I don't really care for that. If I buy something as huge as Messiah Complex, which costs me $30 in US money, then I want that to be a complete story. I don't want this to feel like one chapter in a large book, and I have to pay $30 more for the next chapter. That feels like a huge waste of money to me. Now that I've talked about the general stuff about this book, kind of what I didn't like, some of the context about it, I want to talk a little bit about some of my nitpicks. Things like, the Morlock Caliban, he dies in this story. And I really feel like that was there just because there were 45,000 characters in this story, and the writers weren't really sure what to do at that point in the story, so they decided they were just going to kill off one of the characters. You can tell that the writers really aren't sure why they're killing this character off, because this really just kind of happens and then the X-Men keep moving on and they go on to the next fight without really mentioning this death. I mean, a couple of times they do mention it and they say, don't worry, we're going to mourn his death. And yet, right after this storyline, Cyclops and Emma go on vacation in the Savage Land. I don't necessarily mind when you kill off a comic book character, although when you do, I feel like there has to be an actual reason for it. And you can't just do it for the simple reason that, well, we can always bring them back a few years from now. No. Bad comics. No. In this case, I really didn't think there was any reason for Caliban to be killed. Who is this supposed to affect as a character? It kind of sort of looks like it's supposed to affect James Proudstar, Warpath, but I really don't see how his characterization was affected in the long term either. He was showing up very briefly in Uncanny X-Men after this, and he seemed fine. And he was also a character in X-Force where, admittedly, everyone was really bleak and dour, and so I'm not sure if it was supposed to have affected how he acted in that book, but if it did, well, it really wasn't very clear, was it? At one point in the book, we find out that Forge has been researching into all these alternate timelines, possible futures and stuff, where after House of M, the mutant birth rate just flatlined just like it did in their time. We found that out actually in Endangered Species. But then here, after the birth of a new mutant baby, we find out that in 2 possible timelines, mutant births have soared again. We see Jamie Madrox, the Multiple Man, creates 2 multiples of himself, and he's going to send each multiple into one of the possible futures so that they can gather information, and then what he doesn't know is they're going to kill themselves so that the information will instantly go back to him. We see one multiple go into the future where Bishop was born and raised. And Layla Miller, she actually goes with him into this future, and that kind of has effects on the X-Factor title for a couple years, and still sort of has an effect on that character now. But we never see where the other multiple goes. Now, I was always just assuming that it was Cable's timeline. Something of a spoiler here, but this whole book, well, the final battle is kind of a conflict of ideologies between Cable and Bishop, although it's not really handled very well. That's basically what it is. And if Layla and Jamie go into one timeline, in theory, the other Jamie went into the other timeline that, I'm thinking anyway, was Cable's timeline. But because this book is so crowded with so much stuff that really doesn't need to be here, we never get to see where that other dupe is going. And you might be saying, well, it's okay, it's not really important. Well, if it's not, then don't give us 2 dupes being sent into 2 possible timelines. You could have just said that the mutant births only soared in one timeline, and then you could only send 1 dupe into that timeline. If Destiny's Diaries never ever form part of a plotline in the X-Men books again, I would not shed a tear. The idea of a precog who can see the future and writing all of her future visions down into books is kind of an interesting idea. The problem is, in the X-Men books, Destiny's powers are always fluctuating to serve the needs of the plot. In one story, she can't even see 5 minutes into the future because things are hazy, and that's just to build tension or whatever for that story. And yet, ever since Destiny died, every time her diaries have come into play, it's revealed that she was able to see 10-15 years into the future, and even earlier if you buy that she wrote these in the 1800s when she was a young woman. I don't really understand how Destiny was so old. That's never really been explained in any of the comics I've read. Some characters, they read these diaries and they say they don't understand anything that's going on, and yet when we find out that Mystique read these diaries and years in advance, she knew that Rogue was going to be sick, and that her powers would make her even deadlier, and that she was going to fight some monster called the Hecatomb. If she knew all this, why didn't she tell Rogue? Now, I understand this is a retcon, and retcons never really work unless you actually use your brain and think them through. But the thing is, Destiny's Diaries, they are almost always there to cause more problems for a story than they solve. In this case, I didn't really see how they solved any kind of problems at all. They were just there to take care of some weird plot thread that had been built up in the Adjectiveless X-Men title before this event even started. In fact, they were really there to take care of a character who wasn't even in this book until it was about 3/4 of the way done. That's kind of sloppy if you ask me. Furthermore, if you have a character like Mystique who is able to see years in advance that a monster called the Hecatomb is going to invade and attack the X-Men, then in theory, the X-Men need to actually read these diaries and find out what's going to happen to them in the future. So, around the time when Chris Claremont left the X-Men needed to find these diaries and say, "Oh wow, look, there's going to be a superhero civil war. Oh wow, look, there's going to be an army of Skrulls invade. Oh wow, look, there's only going to be 300 mutants left. Oh wow, look, Cyclops is going to murder Professor X." At the end of this book, Professor Xavier is shot in the head. Now that I don't really find to be too much of a spoiler, because in the very next month, Professor Xavier was the protagonist of the Adjectiveless X-Men series, and he was perfectly fine. Now he's kind of sort of had this walking amnesia thing, but that was basically just to serve the needs of the plot again. So if Professor Xavier being shot in the head isn't meant to actually do anything for his character arc, other than set him on this road of trying to research his past or whatever, then what is the purpose of it? Well, Cyclops sees Professor X get shot, and he basically says, "Yep, we're going to disband the X-Men." There's no reason that Cyclops does this, and it's especially confounding when the very next month, in all of the X-Men titles, he simply puts the team back together and sends them all on their separate missions. This really just seemed like something to kind of shock the reader if you're reading in trades, so when you get to the end of this, you're like, "Oh wow, Cyclops just disbanded the X-Men. Things will never be the same." If you're looking at this now in the year 2012, you're seeing 30, 40, 50 X-Men trades that take place after Messiah Complex, and so you kind of know that Cyclops didn't really disband the X-Men. Heck, you don't even have to see 30, 40, 50, 60 X-Men trades to know that. You know that Cyclops is never going to disband the X-Men, and if he does, someone else is just going to take it up the very next month. In fact, Cyclops did just that. Professor Xavier is a character that I usually try to like, and sometimes the reason I don't like him isn't because of the character himself, but I feel like it's because writers don't really know what to do with him. In this case, since there are 3 million characters in this storyline, Professor X doesn't really have anything to do. In fact, the only thing he does do until about 4/5 of the way into the story is he walks around the mansion and he mopes because Cyclops is doing stuff without consulting him, and he even admits that basically he's jealous because he used to be the leader of the X-Men, and now Cyclops is doing a pretty decent job of it, and Professor Xavier, anytime Cyclops makes even a tiny mistake, Professor X yells at him and says, "You know what, I trained you, you should do better, and maybe, you know, it'd be better if I was a leader," or something like that. And I really just find this to be kind of aggravating. I mean, Professor X isn't this petty, is he? During the Dark Phoenix saga, Professor X even admitted to Angel that he was kind of mad that Cyclops had finally grown up enough to lead the X-Men, even though that had been what Professor Xavier was training him to do this whole time. 30 years later, Professor Xavier is still treading that characterization of being jealous of Scott finally growing up. And that's basically dealt with by having Lucas Bishop shoot Professor X in the head. And then Scott responds by disbanding the X-Men and 3 minutes later saying, "Okay, time to get back together again." This really is really sloppy. I don't know if I can reiterate that enough. I don't necessarily mind Professor X getting shot in the head, especially because it kind of leads into his solo run in Mike Carey's X-Men Legacy, a series that, while I didn't like it as much as his Adjectiveless X-Men, where Rogue was leading her team of X-Men, I did really enjoy those stories. It's just that I wish this was less clunky than it was in this story right here. If you haven't read this story, the gist is this. For about a year, mutants had basically been an endangered species. There had been about 300 of them. Most of them were living at the mansion under lock and key of the Sentinels. And then, a mutant was born in this story. Now that's already kind of a shaky premise because we've been told for decades that mutants manifest their powers at adolescence. Very, very rarely do mutants actually become mutants at birth. I can think of 2, Jamie Madrox and Nightcrawler. We're never actually told why this baby Hope is a mutant when it's born, and I guess the writers didn't think that was really important. Truthfully, I was reading X-Men comics for about a year and a half after this story ended, and I still don't think that's ever been explained. If it has, it was in some comic that I wasn't reading. Right from the beginning, somehow, all of these factions of people are trying to get this baby so that they can do something. We don't actually know what all these groups have planned. You have the Purifiers. They really hate mutants and they want to extinguish them all, and I guess they want to kill the baby so that, mutants aren't going to be born again. Although, what's going to happen if this is just the first of many, many mutants who are born again, I'm not really sure. And then you have the Marauders. They work for Mr. Sinister. And even though he's kind of sort of important in this story, but not, we really don't know what he has planned for the baby either. Maybe he wants to clone it, maybe he wants to do other mad science things with it. But the point is, if I'm asking this question, then that means this book has a flaw and that it didn't answer this question. And then you have the X-Men. Now, they just keep saying that this baby is the future of mutant kind, and it represents hope, or something like that. Now, I'm not really sure what that means, since this is just a normal baby. Actually, it's not a normal baby, since it has magic powers to revive Rogue and cleanse her of this virus that she's had for about a year now. If you're going to have all of these characters say that this baby is the hope of the mutant race, maybe you could have them, speak in English and actually explain what they mean by that. What do you mean by saying this baby is the hope of the mutant race? Are you going to crown it the president and give it Marshmallow Land or something to rule over? What are you talking about? What if this baby is just a fluke? What if there aren't any more mutants born for another 50 years? What then? Is this baby still the hope of the mutant race? And outside of the X-Men, the Purifiers, and the Marauders all trying to kidnap this baby, you also have two other people, Lucas Bishop and Cable, who are also trying to kidnap the baby for their own nefarious purposes. Cable, like the X-Men, just wants to take the baby, protect it, and for some reason thinks that it represents the goodness that's in store for the future. I'm not sure exactly why he thinks that, because he comes from a pretty crappy future where Apocalypse is the king anyway, so I'm not sure why he thinks this baby is going to save everything. And then you have Lucas Bishop, who also comes from a different crappy future. And somehow he thinks that this baby is going to kill millions and millions of human beings and set a sequence of events in motion where humanity is going to slaughter mutants and put them in these death camps and basically just turn the world into a crap hole. Now, first of all, this is pretty shaky itself, because we've seen twice, at least, where people from Lucas Bishop's timeline come to the past and they do something to alter that future. Once, Lucas Bishop himself came back in time to stop the traitor from within the X-Men. It turned out it was Professor Xavier himself. And he told the X-Men that this traitor was the reason that his future was so sucky. So, in theory, if you stop the traitor from betraying the X-Men, then your future's no longer going to be sucky, right? And yet, 15 years later, we have Lucas Bishop telling Layla Miller and Jamie in the future that actually this baby is the reason why the future sucks, and he wishes he could go back in time and kill that baby. Bishop has, for his entire existence, been harboring this secret mission to kill a baby who he thinks is going to cause his future to happen, even though he's already averted that future. And more importantly, how do Bishop and Cable even know that this baby is important? They keep saying that this baby is going to do all these things, and I want to know, how do they know? What if they have the wrong kid? What if this is just some normal kid and everybody else thinks that it's important because it's the first mutant to be born in like a year? It's never even explained how they come across these events and somehow seem to think that they're going to happen. I'd love to see a comic that says that Bishop and Cable are both wrong and that Hope is just a normal kid and everyone's been putting all these expectations on her. Bishop suddenly being revealed to be a villain is really just a slap in the face for anyone who's liked that character for this whole time. I always thought he was kind of cool, a shoot first, ask questions later kind of guy. I mean, I'm not saying he was the greatest character. I definitely think there was some potential there that they didn't actually unlock in his existence. But I'm certain that turning him into a really crazy supervillain who wants to kill a baby and is willing to kill other people just to do that, that really wasn't the direction to take this character. As I said earlier, this book is a game changer. As far as I know, Bishop is still considered a villain. So that's a consequence of this book that's still left around and hasn't been undone by future writers who realized it was a bad idea. The problem is, if the only thing you can think to do new with a character like Bishop is, let's turn him evil and like a baby slaughterer, well then, that just screams 1990s to me. Like, let's turn him dark and gritty and give him spiky armor, and let's have him have a nickname like Dark Sword or something like that. It's really just kind of dumb if you ask me. And it makes no sense when you read any comic with Bishop set before this comic. That character that you read about doesn't in any way act like the character that we get here. He's really maniacal and kind of crazy and unhinged. That guy before, he was kind of cool and always operated pretty well under pressure, if you ask me. In short, if you want a large, spanning X-Men epic that has every character under the sun, then I'd say you should probably get X-Men Messiah Complex. If you want a story that makes sense and doesn't spit in the face of character histories, then I say you should not get X-Men Messiah Complex. Essentially, I think this book is just too busy, it's trying to do too many things since it had been almost a decade since they had had an X-Men crossover, and as a result, it falls on its face pretty hard. I hate to say it, but this book is really not worth your time. And now that I'm done reviewing this book, I'm going to go travel back in time 80 years and kill a baby who I think is going to turn the world into a crap hole. I'll see you next time.